Hello, everybody. I'm going to be giving a audio overview here of the essay topics, and hopefully this will be pretty useful to you. As we see here, this is going to be due on 5/23 on iLearn. That's going to be no later than 11:55 p.m. Really, this is the same kind of essay that we were doing last time. The topics are all different, and we're doing epistemology rather than metaphysics, but there isn't anything radically different in the kind of essay that I'm seeing us doing here for our final as compared to what we did in our midterm. Um, the most basic general criteria that I use for all written work is listed on the syllabus and pretty straightforward. Just accuracy. I'm sorry, let me start again. Completeness, accuracy, and thoroughness. With respect to completeness, that's pretty straightforward. Did you do everything the question asked you to? Are there kind of major steps or kind of tasks, so to speak, that the directions asked for that didn't happen in the paper, or did you do it all? Pretty straightforward. There might be minor omissions, there might be major omissions, there might be medium omissions, there might not be any. So one thing to do would be just to look at the directions and get a sense of like what are the main cognitive tasks this question asks me to do, and just make sure you've got them in your paper. So in terms of accuracy, again, I hope pretty straightforward. The question here isn't the accuracy of your own views, but rather the accuracy of your explanation of the views of the philosophers you discuss in your paper. So if you're discussing Descartes or Zagzebski or Goldman or Gettier, no matter who it is, it's always a question in the expository part of the paper, how accurately are you representing their views? So that's really just about you and the text. For the latter part, this is kind of a little bit more you on your own, but again, not so much on your own, but not merely accurately describing the text. But when I talk about thoroughness, that really goes throughout all of the different kinds of things a paper would do. That includes explaining the basic views of the philosophers you're discussing. That would include explaining possible objections to those philosophers and their possible responses. That would include your objections to the philosophers' views or possible responses in their favor, in their defense. And this is important, your own development of your own ideas and arguments. All of these can be done more or less thoroughly, and it's always better to do it more thoroughly than less thoroughly if it's going to be in the paper at all. If you're not going to do it thoroughly, and there's some point that you just kind of like quickly skip through, you really might ask yourself if it needs to be there, because remember, a paper is not just a series of bullet points addressing certain issues or questions. It's got to be somehow a kind of cohesive, ordered whole. And the more thoroughly that you can unpack and examine and explain all of the constituent ideas, the more cohesively you can bring those ideas together. So there's a more sophisticated cohesive structure when you do that with thoroughly articulated ideas than just basic bullet points and then kind of skipping to the next one. That's definitely not what I'm looking for. So one thing you might do if you think, well, I can't thoroughly discuss everything. That's true. So one of the most important things about paper writing is that you have to make these executive decisions about what the relevant discussions in the paper are going to be, and then see how all of those can really be weaved together to make a nice cohesive essay of individual thorough discussions that all kind of weave together. So in general, definitely am not looking for kind of quick bullet points, nor that you can show that you know everything there is to know. It's a much more focused, narrowly executed kind of analysis, where the better thing is to make a very narrow context for analysis, let's say after maybe introducing the general ideas and getting some of the general context out there. The more that you can narrow down, let's say about halfway through, the real focus of your paper, what things really hinge on um, or rest upon for your discussion, the better. So it's not that you need to necessarily start off with some kind of pinpoint focus, but about halfway through the paper you want to be there and spending the rest of half of your paper talking about that very tight focus that you've worked your way towards. And then at the end you might open it up again for some kind of drawing some general conclusions from this very focused discussion. So that's the kind of general architecture I think that most philosophy instructors look for, at least in the kind of academic Western-ish tradition. So I don't think anything unusual there, but good to note those points overtly. Okay, so let's look at the first topic. This one, these are just the directions here, right? So you can see there. So this is not a research paper. I'm not going to prevent the use of outside sources, but I wouldn't, it's not necessary, and it's not necessarily a enhancing part, like something that will enhance your grade. It depends on how you use them, and if you're hopefully not substituting the views of other people for the space of the paper that's really supposed to be where you're developing your own individual analysis of critique and analysis of the views and the arguments. I really need to make sure that you're doing that at some point pretty thoroughly, consistently throughout the paper, that I can really see like, I see that you are doing bringing some of your own critical analysis to bear on the arguments that you have explained and discussed here. So it can be helpful, of course, in any number of ways to use some kind of outside sources, but this is not that kind of paper, and it won't necessarily be to your benefit. I mean, it could be, but I'm not going to be like, oh, they used 3 outside sources, let's improve their grade. Actually, the first thing that I was going to, if I saw that, first thing that comes to my mind is, I wonder if they've used those outside sources instead of their own thinking. And I'll go back and look, and hopefully you haven't, but really the main thing is I'm looking for you to do the conceptual work, the intellectual labor. So there you go. I don't really care what format the references are in, APA, MLA, it's all good. So let's move to the next topic. First topic. So this topic is pretty broad, I think, and that's one thing that I really want to emphasize about this compared to, I think, most of the others. This requires a little bit more work on your end, specifically in lining up the exact claims from Hume that would undermine some very exact specific claims arguments from Descartes. It wouldn't be enough to generally oppose rationalism and empiricism, or generally oppose like Hume's theory of ideas and something else from Descartes, or even Descartes' theory of ideas, but something like this. It's like explain Hume's theory of ideas. Now that we've got that understood, what? How exactly does this pose any direct, obvious, clearly articulated threat to some very specific articulated argument, conclusion from Descartes? And if you can't find some ways to really line those up very clearly, directly, you might look for a different question, even if you like this one. I mean, for the example, the next question on Hume has a built-in kind of focus that this one doesn't. So you're going to have to create a little bit more of the focus of this essay by finding that very specific link between the arguments of Hume and how, if they go through, they would directly take out something that you can find in Descartes. So you should be able to find the exact wording from Hume that you can connect to the exact wording from Descartes that shows that there's a direct contradiction, incompatibility, objection here. Not just general disagreements about the origin of our ideas or general disagreements about the kinds of knowledge that we can have, but something much more specific here. And it's certainly there to be done, and if you feel like you've got a good enough grasp of the material, maybe you've already got background in early modern, you might be able to do that, but keep in mind that it's not looking for general ways in which there's disagreements opposing kinds of theories between the two, but something quite specific you need to get here. Okay, so I mean, for example, you might think like this, were it the case that Hume's theory of ideas goes through, would it be possible for the Descartes of meditation 2 to have ideas? I'll kind of leave it there. Descartes' argument that he exists certainly requires that he has ideas, because that's the basis upon which he concludes he exists. So does that really hold up on the Humean way of describing how it is that we come to have ideas? Would it be possible to explain how the thinker of meditation 2 manages to have any? You could also think of Hume's fork, in particular the relations of ideas. And you might think like the kind of knowledge Descartes aspires to, certainty, what does that turn out to, what kind of status do certainties of that sort turn out to have on Hume's account? Not so much that there isn't any, but rather for those certainties that we've got, Hume has a very kind of deflated way of reading what certainty gives you. It doesn't give you anything like what Descartes thought it would or what he was after. So that'd be on like his discussion of relations of ideas. So those would be two examples of how you might work up some kind of direct hit from Hume to Descartes, and you can see there's problems with Hume too, Kant, and not only Kant, plenty of other people have noted there's things to take issue with. So at the end of the day, what do you think? Descartes or Hume, but make sure you set up the battle really precisely. Okay, next question. Now we're on Hume still, Hume's fork, but now putting Hume in relation to either Kant or Kripke. So to explain Hume's fork, which separates relations of ideas from contingent matters of fact, in a way which suggests that metaphysical knowledge is impossible. So here you'd really have to explain what metaphysical knowledge is. And we can understand what it is even if it's not the kind of thing that we can have any of. We can understand what a unicorn is even if we can't see any, find any, or have any as pets. So you want to make sure what is this? What do we mean by metaphysical knowledge? So here, metaphysical knowledge is going to be knowledge of necessary truths. That's what makes it part of what makes it metaphysical. But it's going to also have to be knowledge of reality. Metaphysics is the study of the nature of being. So we're looking at necessary truths about being or reality. You might just say necessary truths about the world. So that's what we'll need. And you can see Descartes seems to have taken himself to arrive at such knowledge. So we'll kind of leave it there. The way that Hume explains what relations of ideas are, what contingent matters of fact are, make it look like you can get the necessary aspect of metaphysical knowledge from relations of ideas, but you'll never get the about reality part of metaphysical knowledge. These necessities that we get will really just be necessities about the way we think about the world, not necessities about the world itself. And contingent matters of fact, on the other hand, will be about the world itself, but they will never be necessary. You'll never get any kind of necessary truth from observation of contingent matters of fact. So you can never get both. You can have one or the other, but not both. Thus, metaphysical knowledge appears to be impossible. So Kant says that what appears to be problematic or difficult is what you call like necessary a posteriori knowledge. That's knowledge that's necessary, but also a posteriori that is based on posterior to observation or experience of the world. So it's about the world in the a posteriori sense. So these are going to be pretty different kinds of attacks against Hume, but the choice is yours. So I say either Kant or Kripke, not both. That would be too much to do in one essay because you want to be doing things thoroughly when you do them. So there's going to be a little difference in which one you choose here. If you choose Kant, That's a pretty complicated row to hoe, as you might say. Kant is extremely complicated, and I think just being able to clearly articulate the view that we've got in the reading from Kant and how that really seems to undermine Hume's position, that's great. If you can muster some critical analysis of Kant's theory itself, more power to you. But I think in the Kant question, I would probably emphasize focusing on really trying to get Kant right and to be able to show how that really undermines Hume if Kant's right. He might be wrong. But on the other hand, Kripke is a bit more straightforward. I mean, he's like, it's not just science, but he focuses on science. And we seem to see some pretty darn clear cases now that we've got a more matured science, physical sciences, where we've made some scientific discoveries like the atomic weight of gold, for example, 79, the microstructure of water, water's H2O, and lots of things of that nature, where those scientific discoveries, being a posteriori modes of investigation, just seem to have unearthed necessary properties or truths about those things that we were scientifically studying. The water and the gold seem to be necessarily H2O and atomic weight 79 respectively. So that just kind of looks like we've have necessary a posteriori knowledge, not only but largely from some of the best results in the sciences. So that's quick. As far as philosophical arguments go, certainly much quicker, easier than Kant's long, convoluted, highly technical um, form of response. Where, with Kant, I think it's hard to say, like, where exactly does the necessity of metaphysical knowledge lie? For Kant, it really lies in us, the necessity, but it's still something we can genuinely call necessary a posteriori knowledge. With Kripke, the necessity seems to be out there in the world, that things we've discovered facts about what necessarily possesses certain properties, or certain properties that things necessarily possess. That, you might say the necessity there is kind of out there in the world in the things that we've come to know about. As you'll hopefully have seen with Kant, it's more that there's the necessity of applying the forms of space, time, forms of intuition to sensory manifold in order to have an experience in the first place. So of anything that we can experience, we can know necessarily that it will have certain properties, namely those properties that anything that we could experience has to have in order for us to experience it. So familiar with Kant, that'll sound familiar-ish. If not, it might sound complicated. But anyways, so there's pretty different kinds of response in both of those senses. When it comes to Kripke, I think it's straightforward enough that you would kind of get Hume's challenge to metaphysical knowledge out there, get a pretty clear explanation from Kripke, but do make sure that you explain how Kripke really supports the view that we're getting necessary truths here. And he does this by kind of going through possible worlds. And you'll see that he kind of tracks different kind of little changes through different possible worlds. And we ask a question about, is this still the same thing when we consider these alternate possible worlds? And he uses that structure to defend the claim that we've got a necessary truth here. So do include that stuff about how does he use the possible worlds in his argument. But also I think with Kripke, there might be, I think, more opportunity here for you to do a little analysis and critique of his argument more so than Kant, just because it's quicker and easier to get, I think, Kripke's argument out. So you might think, as one student actually had said, that seems too quick and easy. That can't be right. You might think, something like this, science is often mistaken. So how could we so easily trust the so-called results of contemporary science if the results of all prior sciences seem to have been wrong to the extent that they became superseded by later seemingly improved scientific theories? Wouldn't that also be true of the ones Kripke seems to be relying on? He kind of has an answer to that. I mean, he does, but it's a good question to raise, and some question like that you might be more inclined to kind of pursue and just in the process of describing Kripke's view and Kant's. So at either rate, say here which of these positions is ultimately more defensible compared to the other. In other words, is metaphysical knowledge possible? Dun, 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 dun. So that's the end. Now we're on Ryle. So Ryle, as we mentioned, was very influenced by the later philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and we can really kind of see that kind of practical nature of Wittgenstein's philosophy at work in Ryle's attack against intellectualism. And we recall the issue here is the relationship between two kinds of knowledge that something is the case, like knowledge that the Warriors game is tonight, knowledge that Barack Obama is the president, knowledge that so and so are the contenders, knowledge that it's raining. So it should be very ordinary, the kind of thing we typically mean when we talk about knowledge. But he says, there's much neglected and very important other kind of knowledge. It needs fresh philosophical examination. It really hasn't gotten the attention of philosophers that knowledge that has gotten. And one reason why that's very important philosophically is that knowing that something is the case for Ryle will turn out to fundamentally depend on knowing how to do something. And the reverse won't be true at the bottom level, so to speak. The fundamental kind of know-how that you need to possess in order to know that something is the case does in itself rest upon a prior form of knowing that. So knowing how is really the fundamental kind of knowing. It makes knowing that possible. So Ryle pursues kind of both of these things, kind of showing that knowing how is fundamental and showing that knowledge that can't be reduced to knowledge how in this famous regress argument. So that should be something that you make vocal in your paper here. It may not be right, but it's definitely the thing to focus on here. It's a famous argument. So go find that. Basically gets to the conclusion of that I was just kind of stating. And think of some possible responses. We actually did this fairly closely in class, I recall, and we looked at different ways that you might try to challenge the argument there. How could an intellectualist possibly respond? How might you respond? Are there any kind of just internal mistakes, gaps, problems in the reasoning or some of the premises? Standard way of just trying to pick apart whatever you could pick apart for the sake of seeing if there are things in the argument that can be picked apart. If not, then that's great, but you got to give it the shot. So you might come up with a possible response and say like, this is a possible response, but we could actually really give a response to that response as follows. It doesn't end up being that drastic of a challenge. Or you might think like, it's a drastic challenge. I would think the stuff about that's really central to showing that knowing that relies upon knowing how gets to some pretty interesting and maybe controversial questions about the way the mind works. Because he says something like knowing how to, or let me see, knowing that P requires knowing how to consider P. Something to that effect. I think that might have been the exact terms he used, but you need to know how to give consideration to a proposition if you're going to come to know that proposition. I mean, you can see kind of obviously if you didn't know how to even grasp or understand an idea, you couldn't come to have knowledge of that idea. So it seems like in order to have that kind of knowledge, you'd have to know how to grasp the content that we're going to say you have knowledge of. So you might ask, like, what is it that exactly knowing how to do? Knowing how to understand a concept. I mean, it's one thing to like not understand it or understand it, but is there a kind of practical know-how that the mind is like engaging in? That's like, I don't know, riding a bike is like, a practical know-how activity. Is there some kind of like, what's the mind knowing how to do when it knows how to grasp an idea? So you might think that either that sounds better or worse. The philosopher Wittgenstein, who Ryle was very influenced by, says that thoughts are but the shadows cast by our language, and language essentially involves a knowing how, as he says, um, forms of language ultimately rest upon forms of life, and something like when we have the expression in English, "Ouch, I'm in pain." Wittgenstein at some point says that simply doubles for the act of writhing and screaming, which also signals that you're in pain. But to replace that practical activity, we've come up with this form of language that is the expression "I'm ouch, I'm in pain," that conveys basically the same information. But in that way, he says, like, our language rests upon the practical activities of life. So, okay, a lot of interesting stuff to do there. So really the heart, this one's pretty straightforward, like the um, anti-intellectualist argument against the intellectualist is definitely the centerpiece of this. But you got to say, like, what's the context of the argument? What's he arguing against? Evaluate the argument, and what ultimate conclusions can we draw? This is, by the way, a big topic now. Jason Stanley and Timothy Williamson are arguing recently against Ryle and saying that actually know-how just is knowing that. I think I might actually personally be a little bit inclined to that position. I don't know though. It's a hard one. Okay, so now we're on to Goldman's reliabilist theory of knowledge. Consider how it would provide a response to the Gettier problem. So that's quite a bit to do already right there. We got to explain Goldman's reliabilist theory of knowledge. To do that, you want to say a little bit about what a theory of knowledge is, period. What does it mean to propose a theory of knowledge? And what is it to propose a reliabilist theory of knowledge? So Goldman's theory is actually kind of admirably simple and concisely stated, but you want to make sure you get it just right. Basically, Goldman is just going to say that knowledge is a true belief produced by a reliable process. Boom, there you go. He doesn't say justified true belief, but the quote, produced by a reliable process, essentially is going to give us the same thing as justification. That's going to be like his version of justification. For certain reasons, he prefers, in some cases, not to use the word justification. Sometimes he does, but in either case, what matters is that the particular belief at a particular time by a particular person be produced by a general belief forming process that usually produces more true beliefs than false beliefs when it's applied across a range of instances. So you've employed this belief forming process a number of times. The question is, of those times that you've used that same process, and I can give an example in a second, did you end up with a true belief or a false belief? That will determine the level of reliability of that belief forming process. So here's a simple one. Believe what you see. That is actually a belief forming process, a kind of rule that the mind can follow to form beliefs based on perception, then form the relevant belief, and maybe we want to add something to that. Um, Inference rules are belief forming processes. You can say if you believe P, and if you believe if P then Q, then you should believe Q. That's probably a pretty good one. So what we're looking at here are belief forming process types in relation to the particular token beliefs they produce when applied or when used. And the question is, when you look at their products, the beliefs they actually produce, these belief forming methods, how many of them turn out to be true and how many turn out to be false for a single given method. That will determine the reliability of the method. So in order to have knowledge, we need to be using a reliable method, and it needs to produce an actually true belief in that particular case. So in order for You can be using a reliable method right now and get a false belief, but it has to be, in order for it to be a reliable method, it needs to usually produce true beliefs, even if it gets a false one on this occasion. So using a reliable method isn't the same thing as having a true belief. Although, of course, reliable methods need to reliably, usually, give us true beliefs, doesn't mean they will on every single occasion. But it means that you're using a kind of justified way of forming your beliefs if the method for forming the belief you used is a reliable one. It's more likely to be a true belief than a false belief precisely because you used that method. So that's the general idea. It makes pretty good sense. Lots of people are very convinced about the general truth of reliabilism, though it still has some problems. Okay, so now the difficult part is how and if does this provide a response to the Gettier problem? Here, you got to get out the Gettier problem. You want to find a nice, quick, accurate, concise way to do this. And you could kind of open this up to like cases of luck in general, but give a little discussion of at least one of the Gettier cases so that you can, with grounding in the text, explain pretty directly how this presents a problem. Why is it the Gettier problem? What does it present a problem for? Not directly for reliabilism, maybe it does, but directly Gettier is trying to undermine the traditional JTB analysis of knowledge. Knowledge is a justified true belief, and you want to make very clear how it is, that, and you go back one slide, my apologies. Well, I'm not sure if I know how to do that, but you need to show how exactly the Gettier case as described would falsify the JTB account. I mean, it looks like we've got somebody that's got a justified true belief, but doesn't have knowledge. It seems to be the intuition that the Gettier person doesn't know, but they do seem to have a justified true belief. So JTB couldn't be sufficient for knowledge if you can have JTB and yet fail to know. So pretty clear counterexample that way, but try to get out the kind of logic of that as clearly as you can. You might step back. You don't have to get too mired down into these kind of weirdness of the Gettier cases that he actually uses, because kind of unnecessary. The particular cases that he uses, you can see that in part because Goldman describes a case of lucky true belief in Henry that seems to be a kind of equally good Gettier type of case, but it doesn't have some of the weirdness that Gettier's did. Now let's go back to reliabilism and ask ourselves, well, now we see this, we know what reliabilism is, we know what the Gettier problem against JTB theories is, but can the, let's say, RTB theory, reliably produced true belief theory, avoid Gettier problems? Can it basically solve the problem, or do Gettier problems still apply to reliabilism? Goldman seems to think that reliabilism will be enough to avoid that case where somebody satisfies our proposed criteria for knowledge but doesn't actually seem to know. That's not good. The reason would be, I guess, either of two things. We'd have to say, either in the Gettier case, the person does know and they've got a JTB, or that the person doesn't have a JTB but does know. So what Goldman's going to do is going to end up saying that Henry and Gettierized subjects, as they call them, generally don't know because they don't have reliably formed belief. They got lucky true beliefs, but you could see if they employed that same way of believing across a range of circumstances, and this is why Goldman says it's essential to see the counterfactual nature of knowledge. If you saw the, quote, like performance of that belief forming method across a range of slightly different circumstances, you'd see it performs pretty poorly. If you formed your beliefs that way, you just happen to get it lucky in this particular case from luck. So think about like the barn facade example. Suppose there's like 100 barn facades in that area, or like barn-like structures, and only one of them is a real barn. So only like 1 out of 100 is a real barn. And Henry is using the belief forming method, believe on the basis of perception. So as things appear to be on the basis of your senses, form the belief that they are that way. So things appear to be these barns, and they all appear to be barns. So he would form the belief, and let's say in each of the 100 cases where he's in front of each of these different structures, using that same belief forming method or process, um, that they're a barn. That's kind of built into the case. He would come to believe that they're all a barn. Only one of them is the real barn, of course. So it looks like his use of that method in that context would not be reliable because it would lead him to 99 false beliefs and only one true belief. So in that case, he wouldn't satisfy the criteria for knowledge, and it's fine that he doesn't seem to know because Goldman's criteria for knowledge would say the same thing. Yeah, he doesn't know because he's using a unreliable process in that context. So that's at least the basic idea of how it would seem like including reliability will be helpful for avoiding Gettier problems. And you can see if you're using a reliable method, it's not lucky that you got it right because it's a reliable method. Okay, so at the end of the day, what do you think? Do you think Goldman is able to kind of like get through the Gettier problem, or is there a way that we could still apply the Gettier problem to Goldman cases? It gets tricky, but do your best there, and ultimately see what you think about Goldman and Gettier. Okay, I found my way back to the right slides here, so we're just going to finish up here on the last two questions. We've got Zagzebski and Brendel here. Here we're getting to virtue epistemology. Um, right off the bat, you want to kind of get out Linda Zagzebski's way of defining knowledge in terms of acts of intellectual virtue, and then really get precise on what an act of intellectual virtue is. You should kind of spend a little time with that and kind of unpack her criteria and explain why these different parts of her criteria for being an act of intellectual virtue are there. Why does she include these different requirements? In particular, really focus on the motivation part of virtues as defined by Zagzebski. That turns out to connect well with the Brendel paper that's going to follow. That's up on iLearn, the Brendel paper. So here, we then say, explain Brendel's argument against theories that require motivation for epistemic virtue and those knowledge, which includes Zagzebski. So you'll see in Brendel's paper, she also pursues an objection against reliabilist forms of virtue epistemology, but those are different, and they face a different kind of objection, really the mirror image of the worry that responsibilist virtue epistemology faces. So I think it would be good to actually introduce that objection against reliabilism in order to kind of transition then to the focus on the objection to responsibilism. But it's interesting because it shows like how either form of virtue epistemology seems to inherit a kind of problem, really quite the opposite problem from the other one. And it all comes down to like whether we would include motivations or not. So one thing to do is to kind of pump up or kind of promote the possible advantages of Zagzebski's theory before launching into the objection, because we could say, wow, this theory looks, promising to the extent that, she claims it can solve the Gettier problem and the value problem, and that would be pretty cool. That would be a successful epistemic theory if it turns out to be adequate overall. Brendel thinks that there's a way in which we can see her criteria for knowledge in terms of epistemic virtue is not adequate because it's too strong. It requires too much, and that in order to count as knowledge, and that will exclude lots of cases of knowledge from counting as such, which really should be counted as such, i.e. they really should be seen as instances of knowledge, but they wouldn't satisfy her criteria for knowledge, so she seems to have the wrong criteria. Specifically, it looks like we've got cases of kind of easy knowledge from like just perception or memory or just conversation where there's no motive that the person has formed, in the way that if you're being intellectually courageous, you formed a motive. If you're being intellectually open-minded, you've got a motive, or curious, there's a certain kind of motive involved. Um, when you just open your eyes and form a belief on the basis of perception and it turns out to be true, it seems like you have knowledge that the hand right in front of you is your hand, or the computer in front of you is your computer. I guess skepticism aside for the moment, but none of those cases of like standard forms of knowledge would really count as such, because they don't seem to be cases where we are exercising intellectual virtue in Zagzebski's sense. In particular, because we don't seem to be forming these intellectual motives that are required for performing an act of intellectual virtue. In which case, that looks problematic. Zagzebski would have two options. She could say these cases of what we might call simple knowledge aren't really knowledge, and thus they wouldn't satisfy. It's okay that they don't satisfy her criteria because they're not properly seen as knowledge. Or she could say they do count as knowledge, but there is a subtle and different kind of motivation in play there than what you see in things like intellectual courage, open-mindedness, etc., like that. But there's a motivation of sorts in perception, memory, but maybe it's just a little different kind. So she also has this discussion between high-grade and low-grade knowledge, and you can ask whether there's either of those two ways that Zagzebski could respond, or in general, how and if she might respond to that objection. Or should we say she's just, boom, taken down by Brendel? So there you go. Final topic here. Say, explain Greco's success from ability criterion for knowledge, his essays on I Learn as well, and the advantages it claims. He very clearly lays out three advantages. He thinks that analyzing knowledge as a kind of success, the success being the true belief, from ability, where the from ability part gives you like the justification element, he thinks this works really well. And he says it might solve the value problem, it seems to avoid problems of luck, clarifies epistemic normativity. So here, keep in mind, and you should make this overt, Greco is now defending a form of virtue reliabilism, or reliabilist virtue epistemology, which we want to keep distinct from the Zagzebski kind of virtue epistemology. They're really quite different, largely over this role of motivation. But some of that is starting to change. It's a big kind of topic now, whether there's motivations involved in virtue reliabilism, or there should be. So now we're going to get a pretty specific focus here, where his discussion of Jennifer Lackey, who we also have a paper on in our text. So how does the Morris case? The Morris case has turned out to be a really big thing. Like, lots of people are talking about it. And it's not that it's the Morris case just on its own, but there can be lots of cases like that would be the same, where we can explain what seems to be, and it's very important that you can describe the Morris case in the way that fits the kind of counterexample Lackey needs against Greco. Namely, where a person seems to have knowledge, but they don't seem to be creditable or due any epistemic credit for having gotten the true belief that they've got. Greco says that knowledge is creditable true belief because whenever you get a true belief from ability, that having gotten the true belief is credited to the abilities of the agent. So whenever you have knowledge, you'll have an agent that is due some kind of credit for having gotten it. If there's no credit due, he's going to say there's no knowledge. So what we get from Morris is a case where we seem to have somebody that knows something, in other words, the directions to the Sears Tower, but doesn't seem to be creditable in the case as she describes it. And this is important, that you can look at the details of the case for having gotten that knowledge, because, and this is the kind of important part, he simply asks the first passerby for directions. and he hasn't like scoped it out, he hasn't vetted it, he didn't confirm it, he didn't kind of justify on his own what the person said, he just completely automatically believed them. And it turned out to be right. So, and we do this all the time. Lackey is her intuition is that even in those kinds of like lazy, I guess, cases of like testimonial exchange, that you can still get knowledge that way. Most of our knowledge probably does come that way, at least a good bit of it. If we were going to deny that that's a way of getting knowledge, we'd have to say that there's a lot of things that we don't actually know that we maybe took ourselves to know. So one thing you might get into here, in her own little essay that we've got a selection from her book, I think it is, on testimonial knowledge, and Lackey's really one of the leading people in that field. She makes this distinction between reductionism and anti-reductionism. She also has this discussion of defeaters, and in particular, it looks like even though she doesn't defend anti-reductionism about testimonial knowledge, it looks like that's the only view that would be compatible with her saying that Morris knows in the subway case. The reason is that Morris didn't go through any independent justifying or vetting of the proposition he was told by the speaker, and reductionism would say, well, you therefore don't know. And we need more, Lackey needs Morris to have knowledge, but not be due credit for it. So he needs to know. He would really, if you look at the distinction in her paper, he really would only count as a knower in that situation if we assumed anti-reductionism about testimonial knowledge. So she seems to have to kind of go with that. And maybe that could be an objection. So at any rate, you want to clearly get out how the Morris case really functions as a counter example to Greco's criteria for knowledge, in particular the creditability part of it. And that's very central for his prospects of answering the value problem, because a success that's from ability has greater value than a success that's from luck. Okay, so Greco responds, and I'm asking you here just to evaluate how good his response is, and also interject your own views here about how ultimately successful that kind of counterexample is, and if we can think of possible routes of response for Greco or not, and at the end, who seems to have kind of had the day, so to speak. And I guess Greco could say either Morris doesn't know, which is not his preferred response, but he could. And I guess if you were a reductionist about testimonial knowledge, you might say that, but there might be other problems. On the other hand, he could say he does know, but where Lackey goes wrong is in thinking that he's not due any credit for his knowledge. And Greco responds with a few reasons for thinking that he is due some form of credit for his knowledge, and that Lackey's not giving him credit where credit is due. So you could see what you think of those examples he gives. Finally, we looked at some kind of possible credit we might think Morris gets from having completed a successful communication. And there's all kinds of abilities and skills, maybe kind of basic-ish ones, that one needs to possess and manifest in order to successfully communicate. And he did that. So we might finally, with that asset, it seems kind of undeniable, but is that the kind of credit that is sufficient for knowledge? I mean, there might be lots of kinds of credit, but only some of them are the kind of credit that Greco can appeal to distinguish a knower from a mere true believer. So a couple ideas there. And all right, well, I hope that was helpful, and I'll talk to you later.